But I want to go back to a time in 1991 when there was a summit in Rio de Janeiro. And there was some hope, it vastly predated some of the anxiety and fear and terror we feel now about really the greatest terror we all face, what we're doing to our own environment. But at the time, the people that were kind of in the cadre traveling with then President George Bush Sr. had found various ways to communicate a line that said, look, the American way of life, or the American lifestyle, is a non-negotiable. Now here we are all these many years later. Are we still willing to say that we won't negotiate, we won't change our lifestyle, our overconsumptive lifestyle that we've protected now with a $700 billion budget for so-called defense spending? Do we really feel so secure in this lifestyle? Well, I know that there's so many people ready to question that, ready to say, okay, maybe we will negotiate. But we get a bit stuck, don't we? And then if we fast forward the clocks, there was a time when many of you were more or less on the edge of your seats, and so was I. I was on my way over to Iraq at that point. It was 1998. The United States was threatening yet another bombardment of Iraq, and Madeleine Albright went to Kent State, and then on the Today Show, she made the point 2 days in a row. She said, if we have to use force, we must. We are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller than others. We see further. We understand the dangers. And so another shaping influence that has had tremendous sticking power in our world is amongst people in the United States this belief that we are indispensable, that we stand taller, that we see the dangers better. But in a way, right now, maybe we can see the dangers better because the danger, in a sense, is us and our notion of being exceptional. I find that often maybe the best tone in which I can speak with audiences is confessional. And so I want to confess to you a story of exceptionalism that comes from my own experience. The year was 2003, and the Sisters of St. Bridget of Kildare, Ireland, had called me in Baghdad, and Ed Kanan and I and others had said, okay, we're here. We are not going to leave Baghdad. We're going to stay in this capital city of Iraq because we could see that a huge shock and awe bombing was being planned and building up, and we just didn't know the day or the hour. And the sisters said, Kathy, you'll be coming to Ireland now, won't you? And I said, no, sister, I can't. I'm here. But you've got to be coming, and we've got Shannon Airport. And so the sisters were telling me about how they needed to have a retreat of people to stay strong for this last push as they tried to prevent the United States from using Shannon Airport for pit stops. And these pit stops meant that United States planes were dropping down at that airport, picking up ammunition, picking up soldiers, being cooperative in plans for a belligerent attack against Iraq. And so I was persuaded, and I went to Ireland, and I was part of a retreat, and I went back to Baghdad, and lo and behold, 5 days later, I learned that 5 people at that retreat had done $2.5 million worth of damage to a U.S. Navy plane parked on the tarmac of Shannon. Well, I didn't tell them to do it, but I then became involved for the next 3 years in a trial. And because using scriptures, both Old and New Testament, and many testimonies from people who were affected by the war in Iraq, an Irish jury acquitted those 5 on all 5 counts. And they said that they had taken an action to prevent a greater danger. Well, very recently, the sisters called me up again, and this time they wanted to have a retreat to kind of mark 10 years since that trial, since the 5 had been acquitted. And so I was able to go over to Ireland again. And this time, the sisters said, Kathy, will you talk to the high school students? And I said, oh yes, I'll talk to teenagers anywhere. And would I meet them in a field? And I thought, well, this is a little curious, but okay, these nuns always seem to know what they're doing. And so there we were out in the middle of a field, and our feet are soaking wet, and the high school boys, as high school boys sometimes will, are kind of poking each other and saying, well, now we're doing out in this field. And we were out in the area, County Meath, Dunshaughlin Workhouse. So there's a big, huge, imposing building next to us, and then Danny Cusack comes out, the Irish historian from the area, and starts to explain to us that this was the most dreaded building to which anyone in Ireland could ever go. In the mid-19th century, if you landed in the workhouse, that meant that you'd run out of food. You couldn't find employment. You couldn't feed your family couldn't feed you. You weren't going to be one of the ones to get passage, one of the 1.5 million that got over to the United States or Australia or somewhere. You were more likely to become one of the 1 million who starved to death in Ireland. They starved to death, even though there was enough food to go around. The Mark Twain quote would have applied in this case. It was a matter of distribution, it was a matter of care. And 1 million died. And so the boys weren't snickering any longer, and all of us were a lot more sensitive to why it's important to embrace anyone seeking refuge. Whether from a war, whether that person is a soldier coming back from a war, whether that person is a victim of war. Our hearts were open, but do you know it wasn't until a few weeks ago that I finally read, for the first time, that during that same time period, now let me just say for a moment, God bless the Irish people, that they didn't tear down the workhouses, they left them there as memorials. They didn't cover over the graveyard that was right behind the workhouse. They left it there as a memorial, and those dot the landscape of England and Ireland. But do you know, at the same time period, the number of people who died of starvation in northern China, Brazil, India, and the Maghreb is estimated to be at the very least 20 million. This is the impeccable research of Mike Davies in a book called The Last Victorian Holocaust. Minimum 20 million, quite possibly 50 to 60 million people. No grave markers, no sentence in the history book, no recognition. And this is part of the exceptionalism. But now, the reason I'm reading about this is because it's coming back again. 20 million people could die of starvation and disease. In parts of northern Africa, they call it the Sema, the great leveler. The old ones, the ones with headed beards, have never seen the like of it. 3 years in a row of drought. And the drought causes the communities, as they look at the carcasses of their animals filled with plastic, because when the carcasses blow open, the animals have died of starvation. There wasn't any food, there was only plastic. People pick up what they can and they go, they stagger. And then they get to places where there's still no water at all. Certainly no clean water. And in their desperation, they keep moving. People who are pastoralists for 5,000 years are moving, and they get to the Red Sea, and they think maybe we can cross over to Yemen. But Yemen now, 850,000 identified cases of cholera. Yemen on the brink of conflict-driven famine. Yemen with their neighbors, Saudi Arabia, bombing them, airstrikes, using United States weapons that they purchased, and the weapon companies are so happy because the Saudis pay cash up front. Using United States assistance to do surveillance and find targets, but also when the Saudi planes go up to do a bombing, United States planes are taking off, the Saudi planes come back, they refuel in midair with US jets, and then they go back and bomb further. And so yes, the envoy, the permanent representative to the United Nations from Saudi Arabia, wrote in an op-ed column just a few days ago, yes, 20% of the people who live in the area afflicted by the reality of cholera are people who live in the area dominated by Houthi rebels. But the population of Yemen, 80% of them live in that area. So it's not fair to make it seem that the children are children who deserve to be bombed because their parents live in an area dominated by Houthi rebels. And so there are 4 huge combat littoral ships that are blockading the ports of the country of Yemen. And Yemen, like Iraq, if you could recall that under those 13 years of economic sanctions, the Iraqis imported 90% of their food. The same is operative in Yemen now, and the United States sold these big, huge combat ships that are blocking the ports, and the Saudis bombed the cranes so that the food, when it does trickle in, can't be offloaded off the ships, and they won't allow the fuel to go in. And yet we are to say that the Saudis are our close allies. Our president can dance with the Saudi princes. This is the kind of exceptionalism which doesn't create security, and certainly for the youngsters that Emily spoke of who are growing up, who don't get education, who maybe don't even get enough food, honestly. For the youngsters who find themselves bereft of a decent future, who may turn out to be almost like indentured servants, even if they go through college in our country. What can we offer when the weapons companies are taking? It was perhaps once upon a time the case that people used weapons to fight wars, but now we use wars to sell weapons. If we don't have a war, how can we sell all these weapons? And we know that it came out in the news today, the 4 major weapon-making companies are all making upward of $20 billion per year. So to keep feeding those greedy weapon makers, we have to have an enemy, and so Islamophobia. And maybe it will turn more and more to finding the enemy within the United States, and so we will say these people are dangerous in the United States, these people are dangerous in the United States.